Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. As-salatu was-salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. As we approach the 6th month of crisis and ongoing genocide in Gaza, by now the intention and final goal of Israel is clear to all. The whole world is watching and witnessing this horrific humanitarian catastrophe and can figure out what Israel's desired outcome is. It is clear that to them, end justifies the mean. And if you get into a debate with a person who supports the atrocity and genocide committed by Israel, you see so much hate in their eyes and words, so much contempt in their expression that is impossible for them to see the reality on the ground. The reality of thousands of innocent human beings, men, women, and children being exterminated. When you mention to them this atrocity and chokehold has been going on for the last 75 years, they respond by blatantly saying, there was a war and Israel won. And as for now, the goal of extermination, Israel does it because it can. Well, they say that because the world, and especially our country, US, allows them to get away with it without any accountability. Hitler could not get away with it as the whole world reacted, but apparently they can. And they want to live in a land that they have taken by force and are furious that the indigenous people of the land get in their way. More on indigenous later. They are furious that indigenous people of the land who have no army are not surrendering their land peacefully. While all this is clear by now, and my intention is not to have a political debate here, but one might ask, why so much hate, so much contempt for Palestinians as a whole, so much hate that a random soldier can indiscriminately shoot or kill with such brutality? Where does it come from? Why are Palestinians seen as subhumans? Why such intense animosity and violence that has resulted in over 30,000 deaths and too many injuries to count and so much destruction? In this lecture, we want to answer these questions and explore the root cause through history and scriptural references, that of Torah and Talmud, as I will be quoting verses from the Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, and variety of Jews, including the rabbis. We have already discussed the Quranic view in a lecture called Atrocities Don't Last Forever. We will start off with a verse from Torah that makes a prediction. That is, such behavior and attitude by Jews was predicted by Moses, peace be upon him, Musa alayhi salam, as we read in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 24 through 29. So it was, when Moses had completed writing the words of this law in a book, when they were finished, Moses commanded the Levites who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and put it beside the Ark of Covenant of the Lord your God, that is, may be there as a witness against you. For I know your rebellion and your stiff necks. If today, while I'm yet alive with you, you have been rebellious against the Lord, then how much more after my death? Gather to me all the elders of your tribes and your officers, that I may speak these words in their hearing and call heaven and earth to witness against them. For I know that after my death you will become utterly corrupt and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you. and evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. This is Deuteronomy book 31. These verses are very relevant to what we want to talk about today, both from scriptural and historical perspectives. You will become utterly corrupt and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days. A clear quote, statement, and prophecy by Moses, peace be upon him, in Torah, in book of Deuteronomy. Prediction of evil befalling in latter days, meaning toward end of times. An evil that started over 75 years ago, creating the plight of Palestinians, causing problems and wars in the neighboring countries and the whole region, that which continues today and will result in God's anger through their hands, according to the verse. The evil from a nation that not only causes mayhem in the world, kills innocent women and children, but also has practically turned against the very people and nation who have historically rescued them from persecutions and gave them refuge and recognition multiple times, such as those during and after Crusades, Spanish Inquisitions, during waves of persecutions in medieval Europe, where many Jews found refuge in Muslim lands, where social integration allowed Jews to make great advances in new fields, including mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and chemistry, with some even gaining political power under Islamic rule. After the destruction of the temple, long time ago, before Jesus, peace be upon him, the first synagogue was built in Jerusalem by the order of the second Muslim Khalifa, Umar ibn al-Khattab, who asked the Jews to return after the Romans who had expelled them when they conquered Jerusalem. In contrast, the Israeli forces have taken over the Al-Aqsa Mosque and dictate who can attend the prayers and who cannot. Now, let's make a quick review of Palestine's history before getting into answering the questions we posed earlier. This will be a brief review. However, you can look up more details in all the points I'm mentioning here in many available resources. Historically speaking, the region called Palestine, Israel today, has been inhabited by many different people, ethnicities, or civilizations over thousands of years. The land itself was under the control of various empires and civilizations, such as the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Egyptians, ancient Israel and Judah kingdoms, Romans, Byzantines, and later the Muslim Caliphate, then the Ottoman Empire, including the British control, have all come and gone. So for any group of people to claim this was an empty land and we just came and populated it is absolutely false. It's a myth. In more recent centuries, following the Muslim conquest of the Levant in 636, several Muslim ruling dynasties succeeded each other as they ruled over Palestine with majority Arab Muslim population. The Rashidins, the Umayyads, and the Seljuqs, with the exception of course, Crusades, who conquered Jerusalem in 1099 for about 90 years, and then reconquered by Salahuddin Ayyubi, followed by the Egyptian Mamluks before the Ottoman Empire, who then conquered the region in 1516 and ruled it as Ottoman-controlled territory up until the British control and Jewish mass migration and beginning of Israel occupation. Muslims ruled and lived in the land over a millennium. Out of this long, long past, if we go back like 500 to 1000 BC, then we will find that there's about 4.5 centuries of rule in this land by the Kingdom of Israel and Judah, where Jews or Semitic and Canaanites lived and ruled by kings like Saul, Ishbal, David, kingdom of Dawood alayhi salam, and Solomon, kingdom of Solomon alayhi salam. Sometime between 1047 BC to 587 BC, when the Jews had started infighting and split the territory to Israel and Judah until 587, when Bukhtur-Nasr, Nebuchadnezzar, conquered and destroyed the kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem led to the Babylonian captivity, as the city's population and people from the surrounding lands were deported to Babylonia. The Jews thereafter referred to Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest enemy they had faced until that point, as a destroyer of nations. So there were people and civilizations who lived before the Jews, and the people and civilizations who lived after them in this land. Hence, it is irrational to think a certain group can occupy it just because once upon a time they did. If anything, the last civilization who ruled and lived there for over a millennium, much more than earlier people, were the Arab Muslim majority Palestinians. So, technically, they are the indigenous people of Palestine. From Islamic perspective, we do believe Allah Azza wa Jal granted Dawood alayhi salam, King David, this land and a power to rule it, followed by Sulaiman alayhi salam, King Solomon, which all happened around 1000 BC. It was the promised land to Israel, Jacob, Yaqub alayhi salam, and God decreed it for his children, the Bani Israel, supposedly up until the time when Jesus Christ, Isa alayhi salam, came, and with his coming, this favor would be lifted. In other words, this favor was written for the past, not present. As history indicates, even before coming of Jesus, peace be upon him, they had infighting or civil wars broke out in between different factions among Jews, and they split their territories into two kingdoms until external forces came and demolished their towns, as discussed, starting in 587 BC by tyrant king Bukhtur-Nasr, who also demolished the temple built by Sulaiman alayhi salam. From biblical perspective, they were given this gift of the kingdom and the temple, but because they did not fulfill the law and disobeyed God's command, God removed his favor and their status from them, hence allowed them to be divided and conquered. The Quran also mentions this fact in verse 17:5. After Bukhtur-Nasr conquered them, they were deported to Babylonia, but some fled to Persia, Africa, Yemen, some of whom on the way to Yemen settled in Arabia and other places. They disobeyed again when Jesus came, and they rejected him, and their second temple was destroyed again, this time by Romans. From their Hebrew biblical perspective, they were exiled and must remain in diaspora until the coming of Christ, which we will talk about later. Now, in a more modern time, before 1900s, before the occupation and Nakba catastrophe, the region was a province called Palestine, where people of all faiths were welcome, but majority of the population were Muslims, and a minority of Christians, and even a smaller minority of Jews, less than 5%. Jews were welcome, and even today, there are few Jews who call themselves Arab Jews. They even spoke Arabic. Historically, up until 1900s, before the invention of Zionism, and before the occupation and Palestinian oppression, whenever Jews were persecuted by Christians or others, Muslims took them in with open arms. There was no major Jewish-Muslim political conflict. Those who say Jews and Muslims have always been in wars, they are lying. In fact, Jewish laws, traditions, and theology were close to that of Muslims. The major conflict started in the last 100 years or so, not because of traditional Jewish-Muslim ideologies, rather the introduction, or should we say innovation, of Zionism, which is a political ideology that eventually corrupted this relationship. The word Zionism comes from Zion, which is a Hebrew term that refers to Jerusalem. Zionism was started by Theodor Herzl, who was not a believer or religious at all, but considered himself as a Jew. That is why, in his lifetime, the Jewish clergy did not respect him and refuted his concept, which was the creation of homeland for Jews. It was after introduction of this new political ideology called Zionism, before World War I, where establishment of a Jewish state was debated in Europe. The debate was among several very wealthy families like Rothschilds, who were the most famous of all European banking dynasties, which for some 200 years exerted great influence on the economic projects and indirectly the political history of Europe, and were willing to finance certain British projects during World War I in exchange for the land of Palestine to be given to Jews. In other words, the Herzl's ideology took several years later to come to fruition. During World War I, Britain agreed to the Zionist demand. Hence, British unilaterally agreed to give part of Palestine to Jews for establishment of State of Israel per Balfour Declaration issued by British government in 1917 during the First World War, announcing its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This is where the problem started. By what right did Britain give away a territory that was not theirs to give? No one asked the Palestinians about this whole agreement. It all started in 1917, 107 years ago to be exact. Once British agreed, it started mass illegal migration of Jews to Palestine. This is where the first conflicts between Jews and Palestinians, most of whom were Muslims, started. They initially started by purchasing land, which is legal. Then, by 1925, it turned into sell by force through militia up until 1930s. However, no military operation yet, because British were still in control of the region and a civil war was not in their interest. Upon Palestinians' complaint about the mass migration, British stopped the ships carrying Jews to Jerusalem. It was at this point the Jewish terrorist operations insurgents, as the hypocrites like to call it, started, targeting British soldiers and military outposts. Why? To kick them out so they can freely migrate and occupy the land. In 1946, they planted a bomb in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem and killed over 90 people. King David Hotel, in that time, was the British command center, where the top military commanders stayed. So no Hamas, not any other groups, but Jewish migrants carried out the first terrorist activities against Brits in Palestine, telling Brits, you have no right to stop us from coming here. As a result, British cowardly withdrew and tossed the Palestinian complaint to the hands of League of Nations, UN, who then divided Palestinian land into two parts, with 56% given to nation of Israel and 42% to the indigenous Palestinians, and the two remaining percent called international zone, which included Jerusalem. How did they come with this number? You go figure it out, how they came up with 56% for the Jews. At the end, Palestinians obviously were not happy because this was their land, which had earlier population of less than 5% Jews, now being divided, period. Israelis were not happy because they wanted 100%. As a result, the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 broke out because that is Zionism. During this war, several mini massacres took place in many villages, one of which was the Deir Yassin village, where they lined up and killed 107 Palestinian Arab villagers, including women and children, despite having earlier agreed to a peace pact. The purpose was to create terror among people of other villages, which is an old tactic used by Mongols. And the rest is history, as they say. This was a brief history up to 1948. Back to Zionism, the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community in Jerusalem, Rabbi Joseph Chaim Sonnenfeld, who died in 1932, often referred to the Zionists as evil men and ruffians, and claimed that hell had entered the land of Israel with Herzl. Sonnenfeld did not want the Orthodox Jewish community to become subject to secular Zionist authority. He said, they, Zionists, have asserted their views that the whole difference and distinction between Israel and the nations lie in nationalism, blood, and race, and that the faith and religion are superfluous. Herzl comes not from the Lord, but from the side of pollution. At the time, this was the sentiment from many Orthodox Jews because Zionism, in their view, changed the very essence of Torah, which is its observance and fear of the Lord, as in Proverbs 9:10 that says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Whereas for the Zionist, the essence of being a Jew was the Jewish ethnicity or race, and that Torah's religion was more cultural per se, not essential. The anti-Zionist sentiment continued by many Orthodox Jews like Rabbi Yosef Dushinsky, who said, we express our definite opposition to a Jewish state in any part of Palestine, as he was addressing the UN in 1947. From our perspective, while we believe that Torah is not in its original form today, and obviously would love for people to be Muslim, short of that, we would like them as a faith community to at least adhere to their own scripture and faith traditions as written today. To that end, if you are a traditional Jew, Zionism is indefensible. According to Rabbi Saadia Gaon, it is only common faith that unites Jews, not a common language, not a common culture, and not a common land. It is common religion, which is Judaism, and the heart of it being Torah and tradition. These traditions are collections of contributions from many brilliant scholars who have spoken over the course of history. As a settler colonial project founded by an atheist, secular Zionism dismisses Torah and tradition and redefines a Jew primarily along the ethnic and racial lines, as opposed to Yahudim, which means people of God, according to rabbis. In his article called "The Idea of Israel and My Promised Land," published in The Guardian back in May 2014, the Israeli columnist Avi Shlaim writes, "The Zionist idea and its principal political progeny are the subject of deeply divergent interpretations, not least inside the Jewish state itself. No other aspect of Zionism, however, is more controversial than its attitude toward the indigenous population of the land of its dreams. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, famously said that it is by its treatment of the Palestinians that his country will be judged. Zionism is not just an unqualified failure, but a tragedy of historic proportion. Zionism did achieve its central goal, but at a terrible price: the displacement and disposition of the Palestinians, what the Arabs call the Nakba, the catastrophe." And then he continues as he reviews two books written by authors Ilan Pappé and Ari Shaviat regarding the consequences of Zionism. He concludes, and remember, this article was written in 2014. On one thing, the two authors agree: the current status quo between Israel and the Palestinians is unsustainable. Both see the writing on the wall: the occupation, the relentless expansion of illegal settlements, the construction of the monstrous security barrier on the West Bank, the demolition of Palestinian houses in East Jerusalem, the flagrant violation of international law, the systematic abuse of Palestinian human rights, and the rampant racism, all are slowly but surely turning Israel into an international pariah. No sane Israeli relishes the prospect of living in a pariah state that maintains an apartheid regime. But few Israelis are ready for a truly honest historical reckoning with the people they have wronged and oppressed and whose land they continue to colonize. To blame the victims for their own misfortunes, as the people in power habitually do, is both disingenuous and despicable. This is no way for any nation to behave, especially one with such an acute historical memory of the bitter taste of victimhood. This was an article written by Israeli columnist Avi Shlaim in May 2014. For those of the Israelis who still live by Tanakh, which includes Torah, meaning those who still think Tanakh is essence of Judaism, in addition to mentioned prediction in Deuteronomy 31, we go back to Tanakh and read few crucial verses next. Keep in mind, Zionism dismisses Torah and tradition and redefines a Jew primarily along the ethnic and racial lines. That is, you can be an atheist Jew, and migrate to Israel. As indicated, vast majority of Jews before World War II were anti-Zionist. Why? Because Zionism shifted the focus of Jewish identity from religious identity to ethnicity. There was another reason to be anti-Zionist, which was theological in nature, which was the belief that Jewish exile from the Holy Land was justified based on explicit verses in Tanakh, which include Torah. It was divinely decreed due to their disobedience. In other words, the Holy Land was given to them on the condition they obey God. When they disobeyed, they were exiled, as the history confirms as well. This was and is the traditional understanding for thousands of years. Here are a couple of example verses. Deuteronomy 28:63, and it shall be that just as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and bring you to nothing. And you shall be plucked, torn off the land which you go to possess. Jeremiah 16:12 and 13. And you have done worse than your fathers, for behold, each one follows the dictates of his own evil heart, so that no one listens to me. Therefore, I will cast you out of this land into a land that you do not know, neither you nor your fathers. And there you shall serve other gods day and night, where I will not show you a favor. According to the tradition, only God, through the means of Messiah, can initiate the return to the land. No one but Messiah can establish the kingdom in the homeland. And the Messiah has yet to come for the Jews. Hence, Jews are under a mandated diaspora. And this has been part of the tradition, the traditional Jewish theology for thousands of years, up to now. And any attempt to establish a land or state by force is considered as rebellion against God. This is according to traditional Jewish orthodoxy, not the so-called Zionist orthodoxy heretics. Now, you will also find 3 oaths by the Jews in Talmud based on the Songs of Solomon in Tanakh, which are, I will not return in masses to the Holy Land. Number 2, we will not rebel against any nation. Number 3, the nations will not oppress the Jews excessively, meaning no matter what, Jews cannot initiate a state as a mean to end the exile without the Messiah. When will these oaths end? They will end with coming of Messiah. The traditional Orthodox Jews believe the Zionists have broken these oaths in addition to rejecting the explicit verses. Recall what Rabbi Yosef Doshinsky said as he addressed the UN in 1947. We express our definite opposition to a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. The well-known Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, who was a jurist, said, "The Zionists are the dead limbs of our people, which cause the entire body to rot," meaning their mayhem is upon all of us. The traditional Orthodox Jews argue against breaking these oaths through verses of Tanakh as follows. In the context of some of the Israelites under Moses who wanted to leave the wilderness before it was time, and they wanted to enter the Holy Land without God's permission, God decreed 40 years of wandering on them. Some of them wanted to end the exile immediately and march into the Holy Land, as we read in Numbers 14, verses 40 through 42. And they rose early in the morning and went up the top of the mountain, saying, Here we are, and we will go up to the place which the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. In other words, we can't wait any longer. And Moses said, Now why do you disobey the Lord's command? For this will not succeed. Do not go up, lest you be defeated by your enemies, for the Lord is not among you. For the Lord is not among you. The anti-Zionist rabbis continue to tell the Zionist Jews that this blasphemous project called Zionism to establish a state will never succeed because the Lord is not with you. In our terminology, there's no support or tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them. As Rabbi Yosef Sonnenfeld indicated, Herzl comes not from the Lord, but from side of pollution. Recall Deuteronomy 31:29, For I know that after my death you will become utterly corrupt and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. Therefore, it is very important to draw a distinction between traditional Orthodox Judaism and Zionist modern Judaism, or what we call radical Judaism. Radical meaning significant departure from normative tradition. By departure from normative tradition, we mean textual interpretation that is highly suspect, narrow, and opposing to the normal and general interpretation which have emerged in recent century for the Bible, both Old and New Testament, and the Quran, while completely dismissing the foundational work of many scholars over hundreds of years, be it Jewish or Muslim, not only dismissive of the past scholars' works, but also dismissive of their scholars themselves. Today, we have many traditional Orthodox Jews who reject Zionism on both theological and moral grounds, and accuse the Zionists to have hijacked the Judaism. Their motto is, a Jew is not a Zionist. Some have even excommunicated them and called the Jewish state as an abomination. Among them are courageous rabbis who have spoken out, like Rabbi David Weiss, Rabbi Ilhana Beck, Rabbi Aviad Nager, Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, Rabbi David Mevaser, and others. As the Quran says, لَيْسُوا سَوَاءً مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ. Of the people of the scripture, they are not all alike. But the Quran does mention this divide as well, where it says, لَتَجِدَنَّ أَشَدَّ النَّاسَ عَدَاوَةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الْيَهُودَ وَالَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا. You will surely find the most intense of the people in animosity toward the believers to be the Jews and the idolaters, except for وَمِنْ قَوْمِ مُوسَى أُمَّةٌ يَهْدُونَ بِالْحَقِّ وَبِهِ يَعْدِلُونَ. And among the people of Moses is a community which guides by truth and by it establishes justice. To summarize, you have three major groups: the traditional Orthodox Jews who adhere to Tanakh and tradition, which were the majority before World War II. After World War II, the Zionism or the Zionist ideology was dangled in front of them, and unfortunately, some could not resist it and joined it at one time or another. These are the radical or the religious Zionist Jews. And the third is the secular Zionists. Both secular Zionism and religious Zionism became a radical reform movement from the ranks of the traditional Ashkenazi Jewish communities as they violated the long-established principles of traditional Judaism, the evil product of which is the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians. For the secular Zionist, the religion, God, Torah, and so forth is not even essential. What's essential is just to be a Jew by race or blood. As long as that is established, then if you don't have a house in US or Europe, or even if you do, just move to Palestine, make aliyah as a settler, where you will have a house there and can terrorize Palestinians. For the religious Zionists, like Rabbi Kook and his son, for them the Zionism is the beginning of the Jewish redemption. Recall the verses in Numbers 14. They can no longer wait for Messiah. Hence, for religious Zionists, a Jew may no longer be in diaspora, meaning they can reject the divine decree of indefinite exile. Furthermore, they have their own violent interpretation of certain commands, verses, and passages of Tanakh and traditional understanding. All for what reason? To have a state where all Jews can migrate to, even if it means by force, terror, and expulsion, or ethnic cleansing. Even if it means going against God's command, the theology and morality. End justifies the mean. The religious Zionists, with secular Zionists jumping on the bandwagon, claim that God promised Palestine to sons of Jacob. So it is the duty of the descendants of Jacob, or a command, to seize the Holy Land and wait there for Messiah, who will eventually come and rule the Jerusalem. The command to seize it by any means possible, even if it means genocide and ethnic cleansing, from the river to the sea, as they cite Deuteronomy 13, verses 12 through 18, including Netanyahu himself recently. If you hear it said about one of the towns the Lord your God is giving you to live in, that troublemakers have risen among you and have led the people of their town astray, saying, let us go and worship other gods, then you must inquire, probe, and investigate it thoroughly. And it is true, and if it is true, and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done among you, you must certainly put the sword on all who live in that town. You must destroy it completely, both its people and its livestock. Or you are to gather all the plunder of the town into the middle of the public square and completely burn the town and all its plunder as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. That town is to remain a ruin forever, never to be rebuilt, and none of the condemned things are to be found in your hands. Then the Lord will turn from his fierce anger and show you mercy and will have compassion on you. This is Deuteronomy 13, 12 through 18, which is about people who are called as troublemakers, who have risen among them and have led the people of their town astray, saying, let us go and worship other gods, who are identified as Amalekites, not Palestinians, who are not from among them, nor do they worship other gods. The verse is talking about wholesale genocide, men and women, and children, combatant and non-combatant, even animals, and burning down the property. More on this verse and Amalek later. The original group, who are the traditional Orthodox Jews, are anti-Zionist and believe real Jews are not Zionists. Nowadays, it is trendy to call anyone who speaks out against the Zionists or the state of Israel as anti-Semite, especially the Muslims. A bit of clarification on the terminology first. Majority of the people who use the word do not even know its origin nor the theological source if you ask them where the word Semite comes from. Yet, it is a word that is thrown around, labeling people by it right and left, by which people are defamed, where they might even lose their jobs and positions. Semite comes from Sem or Shem, the son of Noah. So who are the Semites? The Jews and Arabs and anyone who speaks Semitic languages. Israelites and Ishmaelites are Semites. So are their children wherever they are. Got that? As Muslims, we believe in all prophets and messengers of God. This includes Noah and his progeny, Abraham and his progeny of prophets through his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. So then, how could a Muslim be an anti-Semite? Yet, they accuse Muslims as being anti-Semite without knowing all this. What they really mean, are you anti-Jewish when they say anti-Semite? Then the question becomes, by anti-Jewish, do you mean a race or ethnicity? Or do you mean a faith? If you mean race or ethnicity, it's foolish to be against one's race or hate their ethnicity because they had nothing to do with it, no control over it. Then they might pause and say, are you anti-Jewish, as in anti-Judaism? Then we say, if by anti-Judaism you mean anti-traditional Orthodox Judaism, the answer is no, absolutely not. Judaism is a respectable tradition that believes and worships the God of Noah and Abraham and invites people to righteousness and so forth. If you mean anti-radical Judaism or anti-Zionist Judaism, secular or religious, the answer is yes, we are. And not just us. There are so many traditional Orthodox Jews, including the rabbis I mentioned in this lecture, who are anti-Zionists. Why? Because Zionism is a man-made, murderous, and apartheid ideology. It is also a blasphemous ideology from the traditional Orthodox Jewish perspective. At this point, they might still say anti-Semite and anti-Jewish are the same. The question to such people is then, are all traditional Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionism anti-Jewish or anti-Semite? Are you going to call the Torah, Talmud, the verses, and the rabbis I mentioned all anti-Semite or anti-Jewish as well? If anti-Semitism is the same as anti-Zionism, then you're going to have many Jews who hate themselves. Are you going to say they are not all real Jews? This clarification must be made every time someone is labeled as such. The Zionist influence and how it was made with their anti-Israel discourse, when every time someone defends Palestine, they call them anti-Semite. The latest House Resolution 894, which was passed in rush by U.S. Congress or forced down their throat or out of ignorance, in December 2023 says, this resolution condemns and denounces all instances of anti-Semitism occurring in the United States and globally. The resolution also states that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. People are losing their jobs by voicing their opinions in defense of Palestine. Many of our officials are bought by campaign money or scared of speaking out against the apartheid regime. Hence, Israel has their unconditional support, and they will do anything they are told. The history of Zionism is well recorded, and events that followed from the beginning of the State of Israel are well established, going back for the last 100 years. A history of terrorism, intolerance, bloodshed, ethnic cleansing, and displacement of the indigenous population. It's all recorded. All you need is to go and look it up. The events in the last 5 months and the atrocities committed by IDF is also recorded, along with world coverage, unlike any other genocide in the past, and will remain in the pages of history as one of the darkest chapters of human history, when most governments sat on the sideline and approved this crisis in humanity by their silence, at best, fearing Israeli backlash. Ilan Pappé, the famous Israeli writer, said, "When I looked at all the evidence in the archive, I could not believe how everything I was taught and brought up with was challenged by preponderance of evidence. It challenged what my parents and teachers had taught me all the way through university about my country's history. It was the evidence that was too clear and overwhelming to ignore, which ultimately persuaded me to seek the truth and write about the Palestinian plight." So, when we look at Israel's past, it is dark. There's nothing bold or shiny about it. It's always been and will be about force, murder, and genocide. On the other hand, Muslims' version of tolerance is completely different than theirs. You look at the Muslim history and treatment of Jews within Muslim territories, and you will see a stark difference. Genocide and ethnic cleansing are against Islamic principles. Again, you can read the history from Crusades to Spanish Inquisition. So the mentality and the narrative of there was a war and we won, or we do it because we can, is the same mentality as that of Nazis who decided to conquer the other lands, kill and destroy. The very same people who condemned it, as they should, are committing the same atrocities, but they do not want to look into the mirror. European history shows the inherent colonialism by many countries in Europe by displacing or exploiting indigenous people through genocide or ethnic cleansing or forced expulsion. The founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, who was a European colonialist himself, was no exception to this. He was European and wanted to drive away the Arabs. Zeev Jabotinsky, the author and one of founding Zionists in the history of forming a nation of colonizer in Palestine, believed categorically in the hierarchy between the colonizer and the colonized, and said in his article, The Iron Wall, that the native population, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonists. Irrespective of whether they were civilized or savage, there's only one thing the Zionists want, and it is that one thing that the Arabs do not want, for that it is the way by which the Jews would gradually become the majority, and then Jewish government would follow automatically. And the future of the Arab majority would be depending on goodwill of the Jews. And a minority status is not a good thing, as the Jews themselves are never tired of pointing out. The idea of the iron wall that Jabotinsky created in the 1920s does not differ much from what Israel is currently doing in Gaza. Working toward the goal, building an iron wall means to displace or exterminate the indigenous population of Palestine and control as much land as possible to ensure the Jewish majority and the Arab minority. Regarding the iron wall, Jabotinsky does not mean the idea of a physical wall as much as he means a wall created by Jewish majority population in the land ruling over the minority population by any tools available, one of which is the physical wall. Together, Zionist leaders designed a control system for ethnic cleansing in Palestine since 1948, when Hamas did not even exist. Thus, the Israeli aggression is not only against Hamas, but against everything Palestinian. As such, the ethnic cleansing is inherent in Zionism. Balfour Declaration does not even mention Palestinians because they did not even count. A land without the people, as they say. After UN partition of Palestine in 1947, Zionists were offered 56% of Palestine. The Arabs were the majority, but yet they were offered 42%. Neither side found it favorable, but even though the Zionists publicly agreed with the partitioning, they did not want Arab majority within Greater Israel. They wanted a Jewish ethno-state. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, said, after the formation of the large army and the establishment of the state, we will abolish this partition and will expand to the whole of Palestine, unquote. So their agreement was mainly temporary, and the Zionists had always intended to expand to the whole historical Palestine territory, from the river to the sea. In 1948, 500 villages were destroyed along with multiple massacres. Gura Ilan, the Major General Israel Defense Forces, called Gaza a concentration camp in 2004. And this was before the blockade. Jimmy Carter, David Cameron, and UN officials called Gaza an open-air prison. Of course, we now know it is worse than a prison because usually people in the prison are still treated as human beings. And others said it is biggest concentration camp, and now the biggest death camp ever. Today, Palestinians continue to live as second-class citizens in their own country under an apartheid state, according to UN, Amnesty International, and even some Israelis and Israeli human rights organizations. They have no rights, but rather treated as animals. There is much more to be said on the history of State of Israel, but I do not intend to get into step-by-step details in this lecture. Rather, the highlights on what Zionism is and what is the goal of Zionists. We will stop here and pick up next time with few misconceptions and the biblical verses, continue with biblical verses, the prophecy, and the reality on the ground in Gaza in part 2, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.